excitement about birding,
Morning, Andrew.
my passion for research. It's sort of it really has covered a lot of life, and I've been fortunate to turn it into a career as well as have it be a passion, and I'm always thankful for that. And additionally, I'm thankful to be talking tonight about the Birdcast project, and in particular the perspectives, what we've learned from Birdcast about how we study migration in the 21st century, and everything from the science to the education to the actions that we can compel from that education and science. It's really quite a wonderful arc, and I'll describe some of that tonight, and I'll sort of frame it from the perspective of a little bit of basic science about migration, but also some of the methodology we use, and then go a little bit farther and talk about some of these kinds of challenges that migrants face, and also a little bit about the challenges of just facing sort of monitoring how we monitor migrants, and then wrap up and hopefully have some time for questions. So let me get right into it. Hopefully you all know the Birdcast project at this point. Birdcast has been around for about 25 years in one way or another. Its original incarnation was rather different than it is now. It was very much ahead of its time when the first forecast and analyses came out in 2000, back in the dial-up era of modems, before there was any kind of functional cloud computing or machine learning or anything. Think about what the internet was like in 2000, and trying to engage a large number of birders out there to teach them about migration from the perspective of radar and showcase the spectacle of migration, but also engage them in the era before eBird, when eBird was bird source. All of these these amazing things were really very far ahead of their time, in particular because of how much computational power we would eventually need to really do these sort of things right. It just sort of drives home how far we've come in that time. And now, 25 years later, we're still showcasing the spectacle of migration, but we're doing it with the benefit of all this incredible technology, in particular on the computer science side. Birdcast has always been about this incredible connection between ornithologists and computer scientists. And so the idea of kind of taking the knowledge, in particular about bird migration, that we knew at the time beginning this project and that we know now, and constantly looping that around with the computer scientists to try to understand how can we serve the data better, how can we analyze the data better, how can we make sense of interesting patterns that may seem to defy prediction, but then may in fact with the proper sort of consideration for technology and the proper iterations between computer scientists and ornithologists, actually turn out not to be as challenging as we thought. So I'll get into a bunch of that. Now, I should say also at the beginning, I meant to mention this a few minutes ago. I talk about Birdcast a lot. I love the project. It would never have happened without an array of partners, which is just absolutely exceptional. And so the work I'll be talking about tonight, whether it's the science or the technology or the education or the conservation, has been really a result of this wonderful array of partners. In particular, yes, the Cornell Lab, but also University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Purdue University, University of Massachusetts Amherst. These are where the collaborators are, many of whom left Cornell and started their own labs. They're just a wonderful group of ornithologists, computer scientists, and incredible people. So you may know some of them, but you'll certainly see some of their work as we continue along. So let me frame where we're coming from here. I always like to start these discussions to just sort of remind us about why birds are important. Why are we doing this? So yes, passionate about birds, passionate about migration for sure. But there are some reasons that birds are important. I like to think about this from sort of the scientific perspective, the ecosystem perspective of the services that birds provide. They're participating in ecosystems for birds that migrate. They may be participating in ecosystems across like 10,000 kilometers of space, maybe more, and over that space, maybe 10, 20, 40, 50 times over the course of their lifetimes. They're dispersing seeds, they're pollinating, they're regulating pests, they're participating actively in these ecosystems. And then, of course, on the other side, there's probably much of the reason that you guys are here listening tonight. There are these sort of cultural and sort of emotional services that they provide. Yes, birds are iconic, they're ubiquitous. You can go everywhere on the planet pretty much and see them, and then share your passion and knowledge with somebody who's either been there or wants to go there and also wants to look at birds. There's certainly a wonderful way of thinking about how we envision the health of our environment. There are wonderful indicators. The canary in the coal mine euphemism is a real one. Of course, birds are sensitive to change, and because of that, they are great barometers for what's happening on our planet. So sort of this combination of reasons that are both based on their participation in the world and the ecosystems of the world and on our planet, as well as the human appreciation, and also, of course, the economic one as well. All of these things kind of lead us to having birds in our daily lives in a huge way. And basically 1 out of every 3 people in the U.S. is watching birds at some point every week. It's an incredible number to think about, 100 million people that have interest. So as a result of that interest and sort of thinking about what we know about migrants and migratory species and generally bird populations, I mentioned their indicator status. And so one of the things they're telling us is clearly that our planet is in trouble in many respects. Not everywhere and not all the time, but the fact that we've lost so many breeding birds, 3 billion in the last 50 years. Maybe some of you read this paper or have certainly probably seen the news about it. And a large number of these were migratory species. I mean, this trend is not just in the US and Canada, it's also global, and it's alarming. And so where we have this passion and these incredible organisms and we see these kinds of declines, it just kind of redoubles our connection to, for me, why I do what I do with this passion, and then a hope that we can turn around this curve that we're seeing. Now, with that in mind, let's scale things a little bit differently. So part of the problem we know when it comes to bird populations and the changes that we've seen, in particular in the last 50 years, is that where humans are on the planet, they have a big impact. They have an enormous footprint. They convert habitat, we destroy habitat. Yes, sometimes we promote it and restore it, but generally we're making big changes to the way our planet looks and operates. And we think about the human footprint from where human infrastructure is, and it's enormous. Just looking at this image, think about the areas where those yellows and greens and blues are. That's areas where, those are places where there is significant human infrastructure, not green infrastructure, not, sort of typical ecosystems that you might expect to see in each of these places around the planet, but gray infrastructure, built environment. And the spread and the footprint is enormous. And as a result of that, that creates all kinds of challenges, both for migrants and resident birds, in terms of the changes they experience, the habitats that are available to them. All of these things feed back into that alarming curve that we saw. And I think it's also important to remember that where humans are, there's often this association that the footprint is going to create a large impact. And this is absolutely true. And I'd also like to highlight that we can flip it a different way too. So where humans are clearly tracks and identifies where these impacts happen. It also tracks something else, of course, and this ought to resonate well with those in the audience. Where humans are, and in particular, where humans that are interested in birds are, that passion and that interest translates into people observing, and suddenly we can flip that idea of impactful humans from the negative side to a positive side, and thinking about our eyes and ears and our ability to identify birds and to monitor and to turn our interest into observations that we want to keep. Largely was what fueled the eBird project, this incredible global checklist program that's been around almost 25 years now. And this map, maybe you've seen it before, it's always really striking to me. There are no political boundaries drawn on this map, no landform or landmark boundaries drawn. Each of the dots that represents that you see on this map represents an eBird observation, and even this map is old. Now it's like something close to probably 2.2 billion observations in the database, and obviously that's where someone like you or me has entered an observation of some species at some time with some effort expended and perhaps some rich media like a photograph or video or at least comments or notes or something like that around the planet. And you can see that that global footprint of the negative impacts also has this positive side of where the humans are. Think of each human as a sensor, and so there's this incredible network of sensors around the planet for monitoring birds and for studying birds and for understanding where birds are when and how many are there and a whole range of other topics. And so it lends itself to really thinking about the power of people gathering this information to understand distributions globally. And one thing I'd highlight here is when we think about these distributions globally, most of the time people are out birding is during the day, and most of the observations are from the daytime. So that's wonderful. It's fantastic. It tells us a huge amount about where birds are when and so on. But it may not tell us everything. And it's important to recognize that when we talk in particular about migration, as you all know, most of it happens at night. So the idea of how you capture this kind of information about where birds are when on the planet is wonderful from the daytime perspective, but it's often missing, not always, but often missing a whole component of sort of the mechanisms and the places and the numbers of birds on the move at night. And we know a little bit about this now for, let's say, the last 150 or so years, with the advent of modern optics and interests in astronomy and really careful observations. It was very clear even into the 1870s or 1880s that birds were on the move at night. There are some really wonderful accounts of sort of the first kind of novel understandings that migration was happening then. People watching the full moon with telescopes or binoculars and seeing birds cross the face, and doing some of the simple math and trigonometry to get us to understand, whoa, that's actually a lot of birds flying at a particular point in time. And especially so if I expand that over, a kilometer per hour or, 1,000 kilometers per hour. This idea that we could start to capture some information that wasn't just about where birds are during the day, but also some of this mechanistic piece of how they're moving at night, where, how many are moving, eventually a little bit about what species are moving at night, starts to really get to this this notion of understanding the magnitude of migration and the spectacle of it from a very, very different perspective of just going out birding in a morning and seeing a lot of species around, or visiting a particular place one morning and going the next morning and seeing this tremendous turnover. Adding this nocturnal piece when most migration happens just gives us such a richer understanding of where birds are when on the planet. And so this moon watching image, this photo by Frank Doring, he's an amateur astronomer, wonderful photographer, and happens to capture these incredible images. This happens to be a composite of a number of different photographs that he took. But the idea that you could capture this level of information and just do some really basic observation to start to quantify was pretty powerful, and was the way that we understood how many birds were on the move, really up until, well, let's say the middle of the 20th century. Now, around that time, a little bit before, sort of in the era leading up to World War II, a lot of technological advances were occurring. And the idea that you could move beyond just human observation with our eyes and ears, and enhancing those observations with optics or recording technology, that you could start to surveil the atmosphere and the world around us with these new incredible advances in electrical engineering and physics and properties that we were starting to understand at the turn of the 20th century and develop in different ways in the 1920s, 1930s, and in particular the 1940s, lead us to radar. And radar has been around for quite some time. It was a big part of the operations of World War II in terms of tracking aircraft and understanding movements of militaries and obviously critically important information from that perspective. And that evolved very quickly also into using radar in sort of the more civilian non-war times to study and to monitor weather. And in that transition phase in the 1950s, where radar was becoming a regular feature for allowing us to surveil the atmosphere to understand and document weather patterns, there was this understanding that had been there from the very beginnings of radar, that radar could not only detect precipitation and aircraft and such in the air, but also biological things like birds and bats and insects. The realization that once you create a network of radars in the late 1950s and early 60s, and that those radars can detect not only weather, but birds on scales that are far beyond what you could do as an individual, that span the hundreds or thousands of kilometers, suddenly you have this incredible state of understanding possible, where you can monitor at the scales that migration is occurring and understand the numbers and direction and speed and all of this information that would otherwise be almost exclusively unavailable, even with moon watching, if you were able to do that across the board. That was tried and it worked okay, but it took almost 20 years to analyze a continental data set from just 4 nights of moon watching. So not the way to very quickly go from point A to point B to understand nocturnal migration. So back to radar. Radar is a wonderful tool that allows us to break apart sort of the biological from the non-biological once we understand what those patterns look like, and to talk really about the biology. And in this graphic, which comes from my colleague and friend Kyle Horton, you get the idea of some of the things that you can detect on radar and what those patterns look like on more modern radars. Obviously, the first radars did not look quite like this. These are the radars that have been, the images you see here are the radars that have been operational since about the mid-1990s, early 1990s, what you may have heard as NEXRAD, pictured up in the upper right there, or WSR-88D, that can detect precipitation and birds and insects and bats. And each of these has relatively different patterns, not perfectly different. It's not always possible to know necessarily what's always birds and what's always insects, but we can do a pretty good job of identifying those different things and classify them in the radar data. Once we can do that, and once we can go from the phase of moon watching and counting the numbers of birds across the face of the moon, using radar technology to track that on a much larger scale, relating those two things to understand what these kinds of color patterns and things mean on radar, then we're starting to talk about how we evolve into where we are now with Birdcast, with our abilities to use radar to count, to characterize the movements of birds at night. And what kind of cool stuff can we do with that? Some really cool stuff. This image, maybe some of you got to see it twice this fall. Birdcast has broken its record for the largest number of birds detected at night over the contiguous U.S. And so that number is over 1.2 billion. It was 1.25 billion on October 8th. That's the current record. We've only been over 1 billion birds, that is with a capital B for sure, 3 times in the history of Birdcast. So it's quite an amazing thing to think about, going from those early moon watching days or before to where we are here. And let me orient you a little bit to what's happening here. So I mentioned with the radar data, we can extract the bird migration signal. The basics of Birdcast, the forward-facing, sort of the meat and potatoes of the project right now, is all about using radar to capture that spectacle and to showcase it. And so the way we do that is we separate out the meteorology to talk about the biology, which, because of the sensor, because of the way the radar operates, is really dominated by birds when they're present. And then in almost real time, maybe about 10 to 15 or 20 minutes after the radars, the 143 of them that are around the contiguous U.S., surveil the atmosphere and, let's say, detect birds, we can access and process those data. Now, this is a far cry from what the original Birdcast looked like. To do this kind of an image took us about 6 months, and it was not even all of the data. It was not even close. Now we can do it basically on the fly in seconds, as soon as we get the information. So it's this incredible leap forward that's happened over the past 25 years. And now we can do, sort of things like this, where 10 or 15 minutes after the radars collect the data, we can present an image like this and highlight, oh my God, there are, a billion and 1.25 billion birds aloft over the U.S. right now. Absolutely just sort of like staggering in the magnitude of migration. We can understand what direction those are moving in, and obviously we can start to think about how it relates to the time of year and the weather, and also how this might change over time. All sorts of questions come to mind when you see an image like this that we can produce. And I think it's just an incredibly striking way of talking about the scale of migration, obviously the magnitude, but also all this little detail that sort of underlies that we can get into. And we have these 2 different kinds of products: the live migration map that I just showed, and then for the past few years, the migration dashboard, which, the idea that you can sort of dig in and think about these metrics of, okay, I want to know, yes, how many birds were aloft over the whole U.S. on a particular night. Totally cool. Would love to understand that. Really striking. But I want to dig down. I want to go down to my own county. So this is Chester County. This is the migration dashboard for Chester County. And what I'm showing here are 4 different images. There are 3 different peaks here. The peak migration night in fall of 2023, the peak migration night in fall of 2024, that in 2025, and then last night in 2025. And that goes from top left all the way to bottom right, if you're sort of reading there. And what I want to highlight here is that when you dig into the dashboard and when you see what's possible here, the idea that you can track numbers of birds over a night, what's the pattern like? When are the largest numbers of birds aloft over Chester County? What direction and speed are they moving? What's their flight altitude? And then sort of zooming out a little bit more, how does tonight, in the central panels that you see here, how does tonight relate to other nights previous to them over the course of the migration season? And further, what's the cumulative total? How close to 70 or 80 or 90 million birds that typically migrate over Chester County every fall? How close are we? Where are we on the sort of cumulative curve there? And then also at the same time, we can bring in other data. The radar, I should mention, and you probably know, does not do a good job at all of identifying the species. In fact, that information is basically lost to us. Whether it's possible, we're not sure. The rawest possible radar data that we could get may have a little more information about species, but we don't have access to that. So let's just call it bird numbers and metrics and so on from the radar data.
But of course, the eBird data I was mentioning before, well, we can bring that in and think about, well, what birds were in Chester County or are expected to be in Chester County during the day that are likely participating in these nocturnal movements. And we can display that too and have this kind of richer experience of, not only what's happening as it's happening with migration, but likely what the species are from the eBird data that you all are out there collecting every day, relating what happens at day with the eBird data to what's happening at night from the radar data. And I should mention that that these peak numbers here for 2023, 2024, 2025, they're large for Chester County. Talking about 4 to let's call it 4 to 9 million birds, all happening with that peak occurring around the same time in kind of the second week of October. Which is exactly what you'd expect based on sort of our historical understanding of when the largest numbers of birds are passing through. And we can start to look at this sort of thing and think about, well, how does that pattern change over time? And it's something that we have a possibility to analyze. We haven't looked at it yet, but you can see just from this image that kind of some understanding about that may beget a number of questions like, oh, I see in 2023, thinking about that peak night being on October 12th, there were a couple of really big nights that happened, much later in the season as well. Why is that? And start to ask questions about why we see the patterns we do. It's a very rich data set to kind of think about the way migration works locally, and then again, sort of scale out. And speaking of scaling out, I should mention that once we have the capability to quantify birds on radar and to characterize their speed and direction and altitude and so on for a single night or a single radar scan, we can do it for hundreds of millions of them. And we can think about, okay, let's actually think about producing an average number of birds. How many birds are aloft over the U.S. crossing a transect, coming into the U.S. from Mexico every spring and going into Canada from the U.S. every spring? The green arrows. How many are crossing those same transects in the fall? The orange arrows. You can see the numbers are large. 2.5 to 3.5 billion birds crossing those transects each spring. 4 to 5 billion birds every fall. Of course, the fall numbers are bigger because the birds have been productive. They've had nests, they've had offspring. There's some multiple of increase for the birds that are passing that we experience. So really, really significant numbers here that are on the move and indicative of mass movements. And I should mention that thinking about that movement that happened earlier this year on October 8th, where 1.25 billion birds are aloft, that is a huge percentage of typically the total migration that's happening just on that one night alone. Thinking that it might be 20 or 25% of sort of the average passage that happens over parts of the U.S. It's pretty staggering to think about, that level of population movements for many species occurring on that larger scale. It's pretty striking. And of course, once we can look backwards with the data and understand and characterize, how many birds are aloft and where and all of this information, we can start to relate that to other variables that might be useful for predicting. And this was one of the things that I mentioned about Birdcast and the computer science and the ornithologist connection. The idea that computer scientists had was, bird migration and the distribution of birds, that's really messy. It's going to be really hard to predict, right? We're going to need machine learning that doesn't exist in 2000, but does, in 2025, to actually make sense of these kinds of patterns. And as it turns out, you do need some pretty advanced computing power to be able to do that. But boy, we can do a pretty good job of it. We're just relating very simple weather information, meteorological data, for example, temperature. It's the best predictor for when, where, and what intensity of bird migration is going to occur. We've seen this in a wonderful model that Benjamin Van Doren and Kyle Horton published about 7 years ago that's updated with some regularity. that captures, something like 85% of the variation in bird migration intensity by just using some weather variables, of which temperature is the most important one. So every fall, when the temperature decreases, there is a strong connection between that temperature decrease and obviously all the prevailing weather that's associated with that and high intensity bird migration. And that predictive model is very powerful, and it works quite well in many areas of the US. It's not perfect everywhere, and it does fail sometimes for sure. But the idea that you could model such a seemingly messy pattern that, yes, okay, you understand it's going to happen every year, and yes, you understand basically as an observer, okay, I think I know when the peak migration is going to occur. It's a very different thing to think about making predictions about when that's going to occur. And the power of having a model that's robust and can make these sorts of forecasts, I think, is really wonderful. And it leads itself to all sorts of different interesting places. And I'll get into that in a few minutes when I talk about the conservation and education, sort of the applied side. And I should mention this is the forecast for tonight. We're getting late in the season, as you all know. So the migration that's occurring in the U.S., most of it, which is not very high intensity at this point, is occurring in the southern reaches, southeastern U.S., south central U.S. And yes, there's still plenty of migration happening farther north, but the magnitude of it is far reduced from what happened just even a couple of weeks ago. So I've talked quite a bit about the radar side and mentioned that technology. The other challenges and opportunities, that there are from the idea of, well, what else is there to know about migration? Well, there's a huge amount. As I mentioned, radar doesn't tell us about the species. So there's this incredible, lack of information there about, well, okay, like you can tell me the numbers, but what's actually participating, in those migrations? Using other technology to advance our understanding of that. Thinking about, in particular, machine listening. And hopefully all of you know or have experienced Merlin Sound ID. The idea that you can use that same deep learning and machine listening and artificial intelligence approaches to teach and train and then develop models that can recognize sounds at night, flight calls of migrating birds. There is finally, after many, many years of trying to do it, some real operational ways of taking audio data, putting microphones out, pointing them up at the sky, feeling like you have some ability to, rather than just put those data in your basement and store them for 30 years, actually to analyze them in either close to real time or sometimes faster than real time, and analyze them in a way that you can feel confident you're getting species IDs. Not perfect. There's plenty of knowledge that we don't have about flight calls yet, even understanding some of the most basic differences sometimes among species that you would think ought to be a lot easier to identify. But the concept of identifying species and in bringing that information in close relation to the radar data and the eBird data, it opens up a whole world of knowledge about what's happening with bird migration that is one of these incredible opportunities, but also a major challenge going forward. Obviously, one of the things about machine learning and about models, and probably all of you have now experienced also, the way that AI impacts your daily lives and how sometimes you get results out of models that really don't make any sense. There's never been a better time to understand the whole notion of garbage in, garbage out, that you really need to have expertise building these models that can inform them, that labels data, that identifies flight calls, or that identifies radar images as birds or bats or insects or precipitation to train the models. So serious opportunities and challenges. And it's not just going forward too. There are these really interesting opportunities to kind of go backwards. So I mentioned that the radar's been around for some time, and the current radars have digital data, and these are archived on Amazon Web Services, and they're freely available to the public, all federally funded, and you can access them if you know how very easily. But there were additional radars and additional sensors that went back as far as the 1950s, And these radars, some of the data are still available. They're all on 16 and 35 millimeter films. Not so friendly for accessing very quickly and easily, but still possible to do. And so even while we're looking forwards with new technologies like these radars we use all the time, the NexRad WSR-88Ds, thinking about the evolution of audio analysis and flight call monitoring, and looking forward, we can also look backwards with computer vision and other ways to digitize these images and start to analyze them. There's a treasure trove of information that goes back to even the late 1950s about bird migration, where it was occurring, when it was occurring. Yes, it's not exactly the same by any means as what we have available to us now, but there is some information that goes back much, much farther in time. In fact, even farther from the inception of WSR-88D NexRad was in the mid-90s, so give or take like 30 years to now. These data that I'm showing here, these kinds of films that depict radar detecting bird migration in Louisiana and in the Gulf Coast states, those go back to the late 1950s. So even farther back in time than we are forward, sort of from the inception of WSR-88D. It's pretty incredible to think we might have an opportunity there. And of course, the opportunity lies not only in that the data exist, but also that there were people that were studying it while it was happening. So you'll see in the bottom left there's sort of a very simple cartoon graphic. That's from Sid Gautreaux and a very early paper that he published. Sid had the incredible foresight to realize that these weather surveillance radars in the late 1950s and early 60s were detecting birds migrating over the Gulf of Mexico. And to get in at the very, very earliest stages of access to those radars and understanding from a visual perspective, putting a telescope on the moon and watching birds fly past and relating that to what he saw on radar, using different patterns during the day of birds migrating over the Gulf and coming ashore, and what the patterns of flocks that he saw were and how that related to radar data. Super informative and absolutely essential for understanding what birds look like on radar, how we quantify them, even back to the late 1950s and 60s, and then obviously how that relates to today. Very, very cool, and hopefully a very fruitful path that we're going to be pursuing in the next few years to go backwards in time. And then, of course, just as another example, thinking about, let's flip to go forwards again, other tools that we have. Okay, acoustic monitoring, awesome, like the flight call world, love it, been in it for a long time, really excited about it, always, still. But also not just audio opportunities, and obviously not remote sensing with radar, but we also have video and photographic opportunities. So these incredible chances, sometimes a little bit unique, sometimes you can plan for them, to go out with a camera or with a thermal imager to actually see birds as they're migrating at night when you're right there. So not this very broad scale that radar is providing, but the absolute local scale of what's happening over my head right now. And these images that you see here of a common yellowthroat and a prothonotary warbler and a yellow rail, those come from Cape May, some really incredible friends and old friends that captured these data with basically a strong flashlight, a great camera, and a thermal imager sort of guiding where they were looking to kind of add to our understanding of what's participating in these movements at night, and being able to identify those species even when they're not making sounds, right? Very, very cool. And the upper right there, I should mention, that's a thermal imager, and what you're seeing there is actually from the Tribute and Light in southern Manhattan that happens every September 11th, the memorial to lives lost in the terrorist attacks in 2001. We've been monitoring recently in the last couple years, not just with the direct visuals that you see in the left-hand side of the screen, where the lights are so bright that they're showcasing the birds and highlighting and illuminating them that are there, but when those lights go off, we can still see what's happening up there with the thermal imager. Very, very cool. And over the course of the image, you probably noticed that you started with a very large number of birds at the beginning, and there are very few there now. That's a period of time when we turned the lights out, and now there are you're seeing the results of what happens when the lights are out. When they're on, lots of attraction, lots of birds in the beams. When they're off, we see patterns like this. We'll get to that in a second. So let me now pause with the methodology and sort of the technology and back up a little bit to that beginning slide of one of the reasons that we're studying migration and studying birds and interested in them. Yes, absolutely fascinating. Much science to be learned, lots of natural history to understand. But obviously also there's that conservation element. And so one of the things I want to switch sort of gears to talk about here is that population decline and what's going on. Sort of what are the components, and how can we take the knowledge that we learned during the Birdcast project and other similar sorts of research efforts to turn that into something that we can use to affect positive change to reverse that curve of population declines. And so we know a lot about the leading causes of mortality. I probably don't need to tell you guys about this. Obviously, we know that habitat change and destruction is an enormous component of those population scale losses we were talking about. Of course, so too are outdoor cats. Huge number of birds, probably between 1 billion and 4 billion every year. Obviously, not all migrants always, and not always at the same rate over the course of the year, but large numbers killed by outdoor cats. And then collisions with buildings. The numbers are, for the past about 10 years that have been out there, have been several hundred million to 1 billion in the US annually, birds killed in collisions with windows. That upper number, when you get to 1 billion, that's about 30 birds a second. And it turns out, we've just learned in the past maybe 6 to 12 months, that number also is likely an underestimate, that it may well be far higher than that. So enormous numbers of birds they're dying here. Yes, there are many birds flying and migrating. Clearly, we've seen that with radar. And even though there have been population declines, there are still lots of birds around. But this is not sustainable to lose these numbers and to have these kinds of sources of mortality happening. So let's get into what we can do about it a little bit. You may remember that 2 years ago, there was this really horrible bird mortality event that happened at McCormick Place, and more generally in Chicago in early October of 2023. Just this one building, McCormick Place alone, that night killed almost 1,000 birds. And what's going on there? Why is this happening? I probably don't have to tell you, but the basics of this are actually pretty simple. The idea that you have glass and you have light are serious problems for birds that are migrating at night, and then sort of the aftermath of migration at night, where they're occurring during the day. This reflective and transparent glass, birds can't perceive it. They see the reflections as habitat. The artificial light at night, as I was mentioning briefly with the tribute and light study, that attracts birds and disorients them. So it's bringing them in when they're migrating at night into areas where there is this transparent and reflective glass. And this is just kind of a nightmare scenario for creating that collision hazard that I was talking about. That is something over 1 billion birds every year in the US dying in collisions. So this idea, what does it mean? Well, okay, the transparent glass is invisible. And when we think about what does that mean for birds that are flying, think about your patio door and walking into it as a human. You don't perceive it's there. You don't realize it's solid. It does appear invisible. And further, think about the way that humans see and the way that birds see. They're very different. So the idea that you have reflective and transparent glass, it may be at times that humans can see quite a bit more, like, oh, okay, that's a solid structure, I'm not going to run into that, because of where our eyes are located. For birds, their eyes are generally looking in very different directions and perceiving things in sort of the sensitivity and the ability to detect change and to get the most information out of their eyes. It's in a very different sweet spot than humans. And so the idea of flying forward and trying to gather massive amounts of information about, is that reflective, is it transparent, can I fly through it, is it solid? That information is really difficult for birds to process quickly, and they don't do it well. So, and that's the collision part in terms of the glass. When we think about the light pollution part, there's an additional element going on there. Birds have these incredible sensory capabilities to understand the world around them. And when birds are migrating at night, they're using this array of sensory cues, these tools that are really epic, and we still don't really understand perfectly exactly how and what they're doing. But we know enough to know, for example, that when there is light pollution, in particular certain kinds of wavelengths of light pollution, that interferes with birds' abilities to sense the magnetic field, one of the kind of sources of information that birds can use to orient and navigate at night. And when that happens, when certain wavelengths of light are involved, that attraction, that disorientation, the interference with that cue system that birds can use, the tool that they're using to orient and navigate, that gets disrupted. Big problem. Big problem for birds. And that combined with the glass issue, serious issue. What does it mean for birds, in terms of, okay, what birds are involved in this? I suspect you probably know, I would hope, all the species on here. We can do a quiz, but I'm not gonna put you guys through it right now. There's an array of birds that migrate at night here, like black-throated blue warbler, gray catbird, common yellowthroat. There are also some birds that migrate by day here primarily, American goldfinch, ruby-throated hummingbird, and then there's some birds that don't migrate that much at all, like white-breasted nuthatch. They do move, for sure, they do, but it's a lot less regular than some of these others. These are some of the top species that appear in these collisions with windows. So it's a diversity of birds. This isn't all of them. There are many more species, but this just kind of gives you a flavor of what's happening in these collisions when we say, there are more than 1 billion birds. There are lots of black-throated blue warblers, lots of ovenbirds, lots of yellowthroats, gray catbirds, there are soras, there are cuckoos, there are woodpeckers. There's an incredible array of species that are involved in these collisions. And so, in thinking about what's happening in our environment, okay, an excellent case for birds is where there is the darkest sky. There are still some places in the US and certainly around the world where we can see the Milky Way easily and where skies are dark. But most of what we experience is on this right side of the curve, like suburban inner city, where the Milky Way is largely obscured and where this kinds of light interferes with birds' tools to orient and navigate in really challenging ways. And so turning out lights at night is part of the solution for sure. No question that any place we can reduce light where we don't need it, we can lower the intensity or eliminate it if it's or shield it so it points down, cover our shades when it's indoors so that it doesn't escape outside. That's part of the solution. But a huge part of the solution is making glass visible, is treating glass. What you see here is an image of glass that has, in this case, feather-friendly dots on it. So Feather Friendly is a wonderful company. There are a number of companies that do this, that create bird-friendly designs that you can put on the outside of your windows in 2x2 patterns that allow birds to see these reflective and transparent surfaces as something through which they cannot fly, as solid, and that they can avoid. And it's incredibly effective, to the tune of, at that building I was mentioning, McCormick Place, where there were just 1,000 birds killed on that night a couple of years ago. This year, the numbers of birds killed at that building have declined by 95%, just because they put these dots on the windows that weren't there before. Really incredible. So this idea that we can use the technology that we have to understand where and when birds are migrating, how they're moving through these ecosystems, but also how we can adapt to make our activities and make that impact, that human footprint, more sustainable. This is an important connection point, and I think the Birdcast project does a really nice job of highlighting, we know when and where birds are going to be flying in large numbers, both during sort of the annual cycle and during the night. we can kind of operationalize, where do we do lights out programs? Where is it really important to start treating glass in sort of a priority way? We can use that information that we have about distributions to then talk about, okay, how do we target conservation so that it happens really effectively in as many places as we can, but in particular in the highest priority places where there are a lot of birds and where we can do a lot of good in saving them. So yeah, we still want to capture this spectacle, and there's still a huge amount more to learn about migration for sure. But really, one of the things that we want to do is we want to turn that curve around, right? We've seen enough of these population losses that are super alarming and that translate into really bad news for our planet, such that we just want to turn that around. We want to increase, we want to change the direction of that curve, and we want to reverse it. And I think that we can do that with the science that we have, we can do it with the passion that we have, we can unite those two things, and then we can teach people and say, okay, there are some solutions out there that go beyond just simply, all right, I want to save huge amounts of the boreal forest, but as a single person, I don't have a lot of access to necessarily do that. But I can turn out my lights, and I can treat my windows with bird-friendly glass, or build a new building with bird-friendly glass. And further, I can also go out and understand, I want to show my friends that don't know anything about birds, I want to choose the absolute best night and then the best morning to go out and show them what's happening. I can do that. I can tell them when it's going to happen. So this link between the science, the passion, the education, the action, I think is a really sort of wonderful arc that we've been able to capture with Birdcast. And I hope I've kind of given you the sense of, of positive that we can do, and thinking about all of these opportunities we have to learn to address those challenges where we are in the 21st century. I think the best surely is yet to come when it comes to that. And I think that we have this incredible opportunity going forward, and I hope that in the coming years that I'll be able to present to you some even newer and cooler things. There's all this opportunity to integrate the acoustics with the radar, with the eBird data, with the thermal images, with the tracking data of individuals. And it's just a fascinating series of opportunities, and a very fortunate career choice as far as I'm concerned. So with that, I want to thank you. I deeply appreciate your audience and the invitation to speak. I'm happy to answer some questions, and I'm also happy, I guess it didn't make it onto the slide here, but I'm also happy to entertain questions if we don't get to them in the next little while. You can email me anytime, af27@cornell.edu. A as in Andrew, F as in Farnsworth, and the number 27@cornell.edu. I'll put it in the chat, but thank you again, and happy to take some questions for a few minutes.